Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh Science Festival. Scotland's glittering history of invention and innovation is known around the globe, but can looking at the past really help us predict the future? Today our panel will unpack this and consider what some of the greatest inventions of the future might be. This event is free for you to enjoy thanks to our festival sponsors and supporters. Edinburgh Science is an educational charity. Please consider making a donation through our website to support the work we do and enjoy the event.
Welcome to the Edinburgh Science Festival and our conversation on the greatest inventions of the future. I'm Dr. Carol Marsh and I'm an electronics engineer and I'm a volunteer for the Institute of Engineering Technology, which is 150 years old this year.
I'm Adrian Hon. I'm co-founder and CEO at Six Starts, a games company. I originally trained as an experimental psychologist and neuroscientist before becoming a game designer. And most recently, I wrote a book about the future called A History of the Future in 100 Objects.
And I'm Alison Grieve, and I'm CEO and inventor at G-Hold. So I've been patenting technologies around holding physical devices over the past just over a decade with G-Hold, and also food service trays with SafeTray.
So before we go forward, I wanted to go back, and famously Charles Joule in 1899 commented that there was nothing else that you could reinvent, that every invention had actually been done. Yet 122 years later, we're still inventing and actually thinking, what can we invent in the future? So if you look back in history, there's patterns of people inventing the same things at the same times, but in different countries. So if you look at the electric car, in the 1830s, it was invented in Scotland, in the Netherlands, and in the US at the same time. Yet people think it's brand new now. So what other things do you think, what other patterns have you seen, and what things do you think that were invented years ago that we could bring back?
Well, I guess a lot of scientific concepts and mathematical concepts were invented pretty much simultaneously, like the calculus, and a lot of physics were invented at the same time. And I have a lot of, back when I was doing science, scientists would always be racing to try and publish first because they don't want to get scooped. And so I think as communication has started to speed up between scientists and between inventors, it's not really surprising that people who live in the same kind of influences in the same kind of world have invented similar things when the tools become available to them. And so like the TV and the radio, everyone claims that their country invented the TV. That's one of the examples.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes it's interesting because inventions that we think of being invented at the time that they really came to prominence and were used in a widespread way were actually invented many, many years before, but the world was just not ready to really accept them. And I think even in a recent invention, the Google Glass, I remember being at the Consumer Electronics Show over in Vegas, and these people wandering about, staring at your booth, obviously recording. And our reaction was kind of that it felt a little bit creepy, and because the world just wasn't ready for it. And then a journalist coined a certain term about people who wore the Google glasses. And after that, nobody really wanted to engage with them from a consumer perspective. But I have no doubt that Google glasses or similar inventions will come to prominence in the future when we're ready for it as humans.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because I studied AI probably in the 1990s, I think it was, 1991, something like that. And that was a big thing. But then it disappeared because although it was a big thing, there was actually nothing there to invent it with. Mm-hmm. So now it's come back and it's like, oh, look at this new thing, AI, augmented reality and all that as well. And you're thinking, but we studied all of that years and years ago, but it's only now we've got the technology to implement it.
It's interesting with AI as well because so much of it has been intertwined with neuroscience and neural networks. And there's this metaphor of computers being a brain or the brain being a computer, and that's kind of half true and half not true. But you can see, AI today is much more powerful than it was back in the 70s. And part of the reason why is it's using concepts from neuroscience that have been developed in those decades. I think another good example about to do with augmented reality and AI is virtual reality. Virtual reality is not new at all. I remember, going to arcades as a kid in like the 80s and 90s and wearing this massive, headset on some horrible game that cost a lot of money. And actually, one interesting thing is that virtual reality has come back now. Consumer virtual reality has come back much more advanced than the VR in 80s and 90s. And part of the reason for that is because the patents expired, actually, on the original VR, VR designs. And so now work can progress again on virtual reality.
And how do you see that going forward? If we're talking about 100 years in the future, what do we think is going to be happening then?
Well, I think in terms of virtual reality, it's really, I think it's kind of, people sort of immediately jump forward to wanting it to be like the Matrix immediately. Yeah. And so you put on the virtual reality headset and you're like, well, it's not like that yet. I can only look through binoculars and it's not quite high resolution and my hands don't track properly. But on the other hand, it is already very popular right now for people playing games and for people doing fitness, actually. There's like workout simulators in virtual reality, and a lot of companies use virtual reality for simulations. So it's cheaper to put someone through a simulation of training, in a factory or on a plane or something like that, or surgery, than it is to actually do it in the real world. It's not exactly the same, but it's certainly, a decent substitute. So that's a fairly easy one to kind of extrapolate out and say, well, it's just going to get better. The glasses are going to get lighter and they're going to get cheaper and it's going to get more immersive. And what that means for entertainment, and for communication and, for benefits and for also, I'm sure, people are already anticipating things in Black Mirror, or we'll just be spending all our time in virtual reality and getting depressed. I mean, that will all happen, I think.
On a positive note.
Well, good things as well.
But yeah, and I think that, some of the applications for virtual reality is the inability to physically be somewhere. Most humans like to have that human touch, and we've definitely learned that over the last year, that we have suffered from that lack of sense of community. But then some technologies that have existed for decades have really come to the fore at a time like this, like video conferencing, which of course, how long have we known about it and been able to access these tools? But I had board meetings for years that just involved people dialing in on a phone, and we never had them up on a video screen, which is kind of crazy. So that mass adoption of things that have been there for years is quite interesting. And I would think the same with, virtual reality, where if you don't have to fly to the other side of the world to train someone in diagnostics or in, something that's really quite hands-on, then why not use virtual reality for something like that? It's a very clear and great application for virtual reality.
And really important for, helping reduce climate change, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So that was actually two of the subjects I was going to ask about. What has COVID done for us? And as you're saying, we used to fly between our sites all the time. Video was there, but nobody would use it, and it's quite amazing. So that's the good side of it. But I think the downside as well is, as you've touched on, is the fact that we do miss other people. We do miss that contact. So it's okay when you're doing it because it's there and you don't have to travel, but it's not okay when you're having to do it all the time. And as you say, the effect on climate change has been amazing. So how do you think that's going to push us further forward, and what do you see that changing going forward from now?
I think we'll always form ways, as we've seen with concepts like social media, and you've definitely touched upon it in your book as well. I think breaking bread with communities. We seek and need communities, and over the last year we've seen that in neighbourhood apps, a big surge in neighbourhood apps connecting you with neighbours, and a lot of kind of local sharing groups online and so on have really come to the fore. So I'm very interested to see how that sense of community in 100 years' time, how will that be replicated? And will it be literally, as we have been doing over, in the years of humanity, creating local tribes? Or is it possible to simulate that sense of community when we're not physically there, face to face? I don't know the answer, but definitely people will always seek tribes.
Yeah, I sort of have, kind of two minds on this. I really grew up on the internet. My dad brought home a BBC Micro when I was like 5 years old or something, and then he brought home like a PC, and we were able to dial in to BBSs and the internet when, I don't know, I was like 9 years old and talking to adults, and probably not a good idea to do that now. And so, I have all these friends who, I met first online, who I've never met really in the real world. And, these are really meaningful relationships to me. At the same time, it's not better, than real world relationships. It's different, it's based on interest often than on proximity. And I think that there's always going to be that push and pull, between people's need to have physical presence and what that, uniquely gives, And so the way I've seen it is that I think that we will see more people making friends online. I mean, that's obviously happening now with social media and Twitter and Facebook becoming more accessible. And I think that some of the most compelling applications actually of virtual reality have been social ones. I think a lot of people think VR is going to be for like shooting aliens, and it's like, I'm sure people will do that a lot, but it's probably going to be just talking to friends actually. Yeah. And at the same time, I think, as certain things become much more possible to do online, like shopping, or work or so on, the spaces in our high streets and in our cities that were once given over to those activities will turn into hopefully things that can only be done in person, which is, socialization. I mean, that's what people always say actually when they talk about the future of the high street. Oh, let's get rid of the shops and just have, cafes and places to meet. It never quite seems to happen as fast as anyone wants, but that's one of the things I talk about in my book, which is, okay, how can we bring people together, and how can we, have people break bread and have meals together and try and make that a social experience with the people around you. And also, how can we try and, I'm really fascinated about how you can meld those two things. So can you have, I remember reading about this company where they were experimenting with virtual reality, and they would have this kind of like room where they would have a projector on one wall and a table coming out of that wall, and they would all sit around the table, like half a table, and there'd be another identical room on the other side of the country with the exact same setup, and so it would feel like they were all sitting around the same table. I thought, that's great, I love that, Yes. I mean, they're not there, but it's better, in that circumstance than just having everyone look at their own screens. And so kind of creative ideas like that, I hope we see more of. And you do need space for that, you do need to be together for that, but you can be together and apart.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things, I wrote a paper a while ago about 30 years in the future, and it was about everything happening from home, but holographics was the main thing that made it happen. So exactly what you're saying, you're in a separate room to someone, but you feel as if they're right next to you and they can actually see them. And I love that idea, the table going through the wall. That's brilliant. That's absolutely fantastic. And that'd be really good if something like that happened.
Yeah.
But if we go back to your book though, so in your book, you've actually expanded it. So the universe is no longer just the Earth. You've got aliens in Europa. And so, I mean, in your case, Earth has actually become quite small, hasn't it? So we are all a community.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny. I used to, I mean, I love science fiction, and I love the idea of traveling between different worlds. I used to be a member of the Mars Society, and for 2 weeks a few years ago, I went on this Mars simulation in the Utah desert. So I got to wear a spacesuit. It was a real ambition realized, and the book talks about traveling to different planets, and there's a Mars colony. But actually, one of the things that I've come to think in recent years is that humanity's future is not really in space, actually. It's just too difficult and too kind of precarious to try and set up a colony. I'm not saying like in thousands of years or hundreds of years it couldn't happen, but there is this idea that we use other planets or other space stations as a kind of lifeboat. So if we mess up Earth too much, then at least people can survive on Mars. And it's like, no, if we mess up Earth too much, then there's nothing else, actually. So it is interesting to me. And I think it's interesting partly from a kind of social point of view. When you have people traveling to new lands, then new kinds of societies often develop. But it's become an interesting kind of flashpoint where I think I would always get nervous I'd always get annoyed when people say, well, why should we do space exploration when we have so many problems on Earth? It's like, well, I think you can do both, actually. That's my feeling.
Yes. Yes, a lot of technology that's come out of the space.
Yes.
Which is hidden. They haven't advertised it enough, but there is an awful lot of technology that we've got because of space.
Yes. NASA always talking about like the sort of dividend and the value for money from space exploration, for sure.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So you've got an interesting thought about technology and the way technology changes, but we ourselves aren't actually affected.
Yeah, and well, I mean, we are in a set. The human body and our senses, our taste, our smells, what makes us intrinsically human has remained the same through thousands of years. But we somehow don't think of humans also as transforming, but actually we don't. We've not really transformed through all these different inventions, and so that will always be the case even in 100 years. And I think that core to that are humans don't always behave logically. What is good for us isn't necessarily what we seek. There's a kind of an intangible delight that we have in things like the sense of aura around an original art piece. When the printing press came out, and even television, the moving image, we somehow thought that there would be a democracy of art, that somehow people wouldn't need to go and see original works of art or see things for real. But actually we've sought other ways of making something, creating aura around it, like limited edition prints. So I'm very interested about how that authenticity is, as the world of fakes becomes even more and more and more technically established, and material science allows us to create fake items that are far harder to identify. I wonder what the battle will be between fake information, fake items, fake objects, and also technologies to be able to actually verify things, and how important that will be. So, I mean, we have an example in today with NFTs and, the tracing of artwork even in the real world. But will people actually want that? Will we want for vintage coats to be tagged in some way? Does that kind of take away from its authenticity or the aura that humans place on it? That's what I'm very interested to see in the future, how that battle plays out between authentic pieces and the technologies that create, basically replicas.
I think that's a really good point. I remember reading about how, scientists or futurists in the 60s would say, oh, one day we'll have just paintings on our walls and you won't need originals anymore. You'll have a perfect replica of Van Gogh or something like that. And I mean, you can do that now, and people do that, and people get prints or they get, digital painting frames. But if anything else, the original is now valued even more, actually, than it ever was. And the price for fine art is just going, to the moon. And so both things are happening, where you have this sort of endless replication, and remixing of art. But yeah, the allure of the aura surrounding the original actually hasn't gone away. It's almost become more important.
And it's an interesting part of humanity that we seek that, because it doesn't seem to serve us in any way. But we do put magic on objects. People, I use so much software. I love all the apps that I use on my iPad. I love all the software. But I really I have a connection to the actual device. That's the bit that if I break a screen, it hurts me. You know, we do assign, and from toddler age, you know, toddlers assign a kind of a magic around their objects, and it's something kind of uniquely human.
I wonder whether it's got something to do with stories, because I don't know about why. I mean, you know, it's hard to know, like, why do we assign so much value to the original? But someone did this really interesting experiment where they took some just like junk, basically, that they found, you know, like a broken toy and, you know, a snow globe, and they sold it on eBay, and they sort of had two different sets. One they just sold on eBay and it didn't get a lot of money, and the other set they invented these stories. About, well, this was, you know, discovered in the 70s and it used to belong to my grandfather and so on. And I think they even said these are actually made up stories and still they sold for more than just the objects on their own. And I wonder whether it's that we know there's a story attached to the original, you know, and there's a story attached to your, you know, laptop or your you know, belongings. And if you create a replica, you kind of know, oh, it's just a replica, even though it looks exactly the same.
Yeah, it is stories, and actually, that's what my friend said. She loves vintage clothes, and I was talking to her about tagging. You know, would you want to know, to almost have the history of that tracked and sort of preserved in a way? And she thought it would be ruined, you know, because she knows, she said, it's the love. I know that it's had love for it to have been preserved for this time. It's the love that seems to be attached to it, that has existed before and then comes through me and will exist in the future. So yeah, but I suppose that's more about history, the stories of history, whereas, you know, we can attach our own magic to new things as well. But maybe that's us making our own history.
Well, I think that's a distinction between just raw data, which is like, well, this was manufactured on this date and it passed from here and it was sold there, which in and of itself is not really that meaningful to a human interpreting it and, you know, and giving love to it. And, you know, I think that's something that you know, only humans can do right now, you know, unless we have AIs, you know, to do storytelling. Yes.
Yeah.
So I was actually going to start talking about medical devices. So as I say, I did a paper and thinking about going forward, and I was actually jumping forward 30 years based on what's here just now. So things like exosuits, so people in wheelchairs can actually wear a suit and they can decide whether they want to walk or whether they want to sit. Bionic arms, which are now being attached to your nerves. And this is my future, that I think that we'll be able to overcome almost any of these problems like ocular implants, so you can actually see. And do you think that's going to be possible going forward?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that we're really only scratching the surface of what's possible. Obviously, people already have prosthetics and very advanced prosthetics right now, and it's changed a lot of people's lives. You know, every month I think we're learning about new, you know, amazing new kinds of developments. Just this morning, I read about how a kind of brain implant allows, you know, is allowing someone, a paraplegic, to write just using, you know, their thoughts at 18 words per minute, which is actually amazing because they weren't originally trained to do that. And so the medical, I mean, implications are absolutely enormous. You have, you know, hearing implants, you have, you know, retinal, you know, regrowth. It's just absolutely extraordinary. I think that there's a sort of potentially dark side to this, which is that these are all very expensive procedures, right? And so then is it going to be the case that only rich people have, you know, the ability to access these things, especially as they get older, you know? And, you know, will they be able to kind of retain their abilities longer? But I think that one of the things I was really interested in in my book was looking at also what it means for other areas of life. So, you know, I talk about how at the moment, you know, the popularity of the Paralympic Games is getting bigger and bigger. People really enjoy watching these. And I talk about how, you know, there was some thought about, well, is it possible, you know, at what point will people in the Paralympic Games outperform people in the normal Olympics, right? I mean, it's certainly possible when you think about it. And if you have the continued development of really advanced, you know, prosthetics, you know, does the Paralympic Games become more popular than the Olympic Games, actually? Because people, you know, like this sort of interaction of technology and the human body. So I didn't, you know, that's one of the things that I was fascinated by.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I talk about, because there's a cybernetics at the moment, Olympics, which only have 6 items in it, 6 events. But going forward, will that take over the Paralympics? You know, and it's quite amazing to think about that.
And then where is it a battle of the engineers as opposed to a battle of the humans? Like the, you know, F1 driving, how much of that is, you know, the engineers or the human who drives. So it will be really interesting to see, you know, where does the limit lie as a percentage of human involvement, I suppose. Yeah.
And that can actually go for the human body as well. You know, I remember when I was younger, a $6 million man, you know, and then there was a $6 million woman. I think she had more prosthetics than he did. But going forward, you could actually end up having people which, almost like a Robocop, couldn't you? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing, or what do we think?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the human body is just the most incredible machine as it is, and there are, even now, there are limitations in prosthetics, in movement and control, and also what type of limb, you know, they can be attached to. That we often just look at the finished result, but actually I think, you know, that it's often quite complex. But what is it that, you know, I think it's where we start to, there's something about the brain. The more we start interfering with the brain, I think that we just have a reaction to that. So it will be interesting, the ethics of that in the future. You know, what we're comfortable with, and at what time we're comfortable. Will it be a gradual creeping to, you know, into how we connect our brain to physical items or physical movements? I think that that's where debates will form in the future.
Yeah, there is this theory that smartphones have already started to, you know, take over certain, I mean, I don't remember anyone's phone numbers anymore, you know, I don't know about you. And that, you know, certain, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I think it's true, you know, there are certain things we don't have to remember anymore, because if you always have your phone with you, and especially if you use, you know, personal assistant, then you can just ask someone and they'll tell you. And I mean, that's not a new thing. Of course, the invention of writing, you know, and just permanent, you know, storage is where that begins. But it's also true that, come on, you know, a smartphone is very different from a notepad. You know, there's only so many books you can carry around in your backpack. And as a gap between asking a question, oh, what was it I was meant to do, you know, tomorrow? You get your phone out, you look at your calendar app. As that gets smaller and smaller, and you just think of the question, which theoretically we could do now, and then you get the answer in a little, you know, pop up in your glasses or something else, then I mean, it's literally not science fiction. You can practically do that now, and no one actually has any idea what this is going to do to people in the long term.
Yeah, I remember my colleague a few years ago, again at Consumer Electronics Show, managed to move a robot with her brain, and was really quite astonished by that ability. But it will be, you know, where's our comfort level? But, you know, I can definitely see very shortly people won't know how to type anymore, because why would you need to? And there'll probably be resistance to that. But I cannot imagine a scenario with us typing in 100 years' time.
I read a really fascinating short story by Ted Chiang, where he imagined that people might stop learning how to write. Certainly, like, you know, in terms of handwriting and typing, they would just dictate, right? Yeah. And they would still be able to read, but they just wouldn't be able to write.
Yeah.
And yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, I hate dictating, actually, but you can see that actually voice recognition is getting really, really good. Yeah. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of subvocalization, which is having, one of the problems of dictation is that people can hear what you're saying, which is kind of rude to do on a train or, you know, in an office. You know, it doesn't really work that way. But if you have a microphone, you know, on your throat, or, you know, sensing your vocal cords, then you can essentially dictate or you know, write without saying anything or doing anything visible. And that, to me, is really fascinating.
Yeah. Yep. It's actually another fascinating one. So I read in your book about the Babel sculpture.
Yes.
And again, I mean, I'm a big Star Trek fan, so I'm going to admit that. And the one thing I love about it is the universal translator, right? And obviously that's, you said the sculpture's been produced because people have forgotten how to learn languages because they're always using this universal translator. But do you think that's a reality? I think we'll get there.
I mean, I think that we're already in a situation where a lot of languages are dying out. I mean, that's just happening, and it has been happening for hundreds of years. And so it's really important that those languages get preserved somehow. But I mean, even in Scotland, you know, you have, you know, Gaelic not being spoken by as many people as it used to be. So you know, and in China, you know, that they're trying to get more people to speak Mandarin versus Cantonese. So, you know, maybe that will change. I'm not so sure. And I think at the same time, you have, you know, Google Translate and DeepMind. I mean, it's just incredible, actually, how good this stuff is. I mean, it's not as good as like a human translator, but it used to be that you tried to translate, you know, machine translate text you found on the internet, and it would just be, you know, nonsense. Now, when I think about doing like French homework at school, I'm like, does anyone do this anymore, or do they just put it into, you know, Google Translate? I don't know. You know, I wonder what happens there.
But one of the things that's interesting about that is what we will. I know I keep going on about human, but we're so capable. Our human minds are so capable, and so we think very literally about languages being lost. But it's actually the part of our brains that utilizes and forces us to engage with from a young age that is really important about learning languages. And the same with writing and, you know, certain movements. It connects up different parts of our brain. So, you know, will our brains become lazy in the future the more that is taken off our hands, the less we need to learn? You know, what will be kind of training exercises in the future? I'm sure that will be a part of education to try and basically work out our brain so that they don't become too lazy. Because, you know, even now surgeons are struggling because of the dexterity that they've lost through not handwriting all the time. They're struggling with some of the more minute kind of, you know, intricate surgeries. So that will be, I wonder how we'll train ourselves to stay kind of mentally fit in the future.
Well, you know, on the surgery, there's some studies that show that playing video games actually helps with that. So maybe that's the answer. They just need to play more PlayStation. I think that's a really good point about. I mean, language is very. I mean, it seems to be, you know, an inherent part of the human brain, and so, you know, the plus side for people retaining multiple languages, which I think I'm always jealous of my friends who can speak, you know, 15 languages. You know, not 15, but 5 languages. It's really cool, you know, and it's so. I wish I was able to do that. And when you're young, you know, when you're a child or an infant, it's easy, actually, to pick up multiple languages. It's like we're wired to do it. However, learning reading and writing is actually not something that it seems that we're wired to do. You know, that's something that is actually really hard to do, and it's something that you have to kind of remap different neural circuits onto. And so I think that actually, you know, spoken word and learning languages will be just fine. I think that reading and writing, I'm kind of curious actually, like what will happen to that. And that's why I think, we will, it's, I mean, I love reading and writing. I think, I think it's just the most, you know, in terms of inventions and technology, writing, you know, the written word has to be, you know, possibly the most important, but, you know, possibly, you know, there are technologies that might supersede that.
So you think if we went forward 100 years, we would actually want to do these things for fun, out of necessity.
Like a hobby.
Yes.
You'd have like writing clubs.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, like handwriting, the people, like I can, I had to, we all had to learn cursive at school, but a lot of people, I feel like, like if you asked me to write like a 5-page essay, my hand would probably fall off, by page 3. I can't do it, like it cramps up. You do have to have practice, like you say.
Yeah. I mean, for my family, I have many dyslexics in my family, so in that sense, it kind of evens the playing field for accessibility for different types of minds. It might make it more, and also writing and reading and writing, that's ultimately communication, and so to separate kind of the art of it from the communication, it will be interesting to see new ways of communicating, like many of which you discussed in your book. What will be the many ways of communicating, and what will be the ways of eliminating too much communication, where it becomes information overload, which will be very interesting in the future, I think.
Well, such as, I guess we're talking about the kind of fake,
or like the glass that where you kind of you have a system whereby you can organize information so that it's not just kind of chaotic.
I think that we're already seeing this right now. I mean, with social media, people say they're suffering from information overload. I feel like it. We have these endless social media feeds on Twitter and Facebook, and yet it's all happening in real time, and it's happening in a way that feels inescapable to people, in the sense that people have this fear of missing out, and you're getting pings on your phone, and soon there'll be pings in your glasses and elsewhere, and obviously social media platforms are trying to filter, and they're trying to regulate the flow of information to people so that only the most important information comes through to you. And that's causing a lot of problem because how are these algorithms governed and what gets promoted? And I think that when it comes to augmented reality, which will be very important, heads-up displays where it changes what you see, it's imagine whatever however bad you think Twitter is and Facebook is, just imagine that 10 times better, or what better or worse. It can be better as well. And the only way I kind of really see forward for this is for people to have more control over like the algorithms that actually determine what they see, because it's easy to just go and say, well, I'll let Facebook or let Twitter decide, or Apple or Google to decide what I see. But I think that as soon as it starts changing literally how you see the world, then it has really profound implications for democracy. And I mean, we've already seen in America of the U.S. elections. It's just people are seeing different things, and they're overloaded with information, and augmented reality and virtual reality, we need to be really careful.
There's an interesting part in your book about people creating their own planets.
Yes.
Is it, I've forgotten the name of it, sorry.
Tianxia.
Tianxia, yes.
Yeah.
That is really fascinating. Would you like to give us a little bit of information on that?
Yeah, I mean, that comes from, I love simulation games, like SimCity and SimWorld and things like that. And, there's certain kinds of games where you're very active and you're just, exploring a world, or it's first-person games or third-person games or multiplayer games. And there's other kinds of games where you sort of set in motion, you create a little miniature world, and you kind of sit back and you don't really play it that much. You just watch, a little bit like a soap opera. And my idea there was that, games and computers will become sophisticated enough that the simulations become really detailed. And so you could simulate an approximation of like an entire planet, and you could just sit back and just imagine, what would happen to this little civilization if I, created an ice age, or if I sort of had like like another moon appear, will they sort of create a new religion or something? And I think that there is something I mean, in video games, we call them gold games, actually, which maybe says something about, how people see themselves playing it. Yeah.
And isn't the conclusion at the end, the last chapter, basically on the fact that this world is a simulation?
That's one of the, yeah. That's
almost like Men in Black.
Right. That's one of the last chapters. I mean, that's a kind of interesting hypothesis. There's this theory, the simulationist theory, that basically it goes like this. It says, okay, well, we know that we can have computers that can simulate, virtual worlds, right? Very simple virtual worlds. And so, can you imagine a computer that is so powerful that it could simulate, a world like our own? Well, maybe, I guess, if you had a computer the size of, the sun or a solar system, and it was fast enough and you had enough energy, yeah, why not? Sure. And then people say, well, okay, if you can make a computer that can simulate a universe, then isn't it more likely that we live in a universe that is actually a simulation? Because you could have 1,000 computers simulating a universe. So you could have a universe that's simulating another universe, And so by using probability theory, some people have decided, you know what, it's actually incredibly likely that we live in a simulation rather than the top level, the first, who lives in the first universe and who lives in the sort of like rubbish, 30-second simulated universe. So yeah, probably we're in like, here rather than at the top. And so some physicists have had this idea that, well, maybe we can tell. Can we tell if we live in a simulation? Maybe you might try and break the simulation or do some particle acceleration experiments and so on. And I thought it was kind of a fun joke, like to sort of write this little short story where people say, well, maybe we shouldn't try and check, because if they notice we're checking, that they might realize and turn us off. And that's,
yeah, it might crash the system.
Well, yeah. And I mean, it's funny because I think that so much of this really is more about how we see the world right now today. Right? If you go back 300 years or 400 years, everyone saw the world, Galileo, or Kepler saw the world as a clockwork machine. That was a new system of the world. And before that, people thought, well, it's just gods, basically. That's how the heavens move. It's just gods. And no one really understands. And then it became clockwork. And then it became, whatever new technology was happening, like telegraphs and pneumatic tubes and whatever. And now it's computers. And so maybe I'm being a bit biased, but I think that I wouldn't be surprised in 100 years when we have some new technology. It'd be like, okay, yeah, that's actually what the universe is. It's that new thing, of course.
Yeah.
It's quite comforting to sort of externalize the world's problems.
Yes.
Yeah.
So as you say, it probably will be the same in 100 years in some sort of way where it doesn't really make it our fault, whatever is going on in the world. It gives me comfort because I think, well, over the past couple of years when things have been so tumultuous, then I've thought, well, at least there's some master plan. If we're living in a simulation, we're solving some other world's problems. So
someone can just go and rewind. Yes.
Yeah.
So what invention are you really excited about now that you can see going forward in the future?
I'm very excited about materials technology and using natural materials to replace some of our materials that have been more destructive on the world. So I think there's a lot happening with nanocellulose material and the reusing of bio-waste materials and all of the movement towards really protecting our Earth, because we don't know in 100 years whether we'll be able to do space exploration. And I am very much of the camp that it would be great if we could just fix this miraculous world and manage to right some of our wrongs. And I do think there's incredible technologies that exist in the world today that are really helping us to do that. And so those are the inventions, because it is an emergency. And so I think that those are the inventions that I'm most excited about, not a singular one, but all the work which is being done in that space. It's very exciting.
I think I'm most interested in inventions that will try and stop climate change right now. I think the other ones will sort of take care of themselves, like augmented reality. Those are really cool, but the really important things are things like carbon capture, and one thing that I'm really fascinated by are meat substitutes. You know, I think it's just really, you know, like a pretty large proportion of carbon emissions comes from just meat that we eat. And it's just incredible, actually, how advanced some of these meat substitutes are now, just made from plants or from you know, cloned meat. And I think that if we are able to nail that and figure out a way of replacing most of, you know, the meat that people eat during the, you know, their lives into something that is just as tasty or tastier and healthier and cheaper, then that's, you know, that's a win-win, you know, for everyone.
So to me, it's medical advances. So we're started looking at personalised medication. We're looking at our genome sequence. I was talking not that long ago with someone who was talking about how they can actually read your DNA and from it find out what's actually wrong with you. So instead of you getting pills from the doctor on what he thinks is wrong with you or what could likely be wrong with you, they can actually go back to your DNA and say that's actually what's wrong with you. And I think, to me personally, that going forward is going to be quite amazing. How they're going to actually, register it and see how it's going to work and how they're going to get it through all the authorities is going to be quite difficult. But I actually think that's going to be amazing, that someone will actually look at you as a person and say, this is actually what's wrong, and fix that. Yeah, I think that would be a wonderful thing to happen. So I would like to thank you very much. I think that's been a very interesting conversation. And I would also like to thank the Edinburgh Science Festival for hosting us. And I hope you have enjoyed this event.